Have you ever wondered how someone could confront kings, perform miracles, and still struggle with the same fears and challenges we do? The story of Elijah reveals a secret that few truly grasp. Even the greatest heroes of faith face moments of weakness, but it is precisely in those moments that God's care manifests most powerfully. It seems paradoxical, doesn't it? How could someone so close to God ask for his life to end? Yet this is the transformative lesson. Elijah's secret isn't just about his courage. It's about his complete reliance on God's care, which sustained him in the most barren deserts and carried him to heaven in a whirlwind. Perhaps you're going through what feels like an impossible situation, a spiritual or emotional desert that drains your strength. Elijah has been there, hiding in caves, fed by ravens and comforted by God's whisper. And the most fascinating part, those moments weren't the end of his story, but the beginning of something extraordinary. Elijah teaches us that God uses our weakest moments to reveal his greatest power. So if you feel like you're at your breaking point, you may be on the verge of witnessing one of the greatest miracles in your life. Get ready to embark on a journey where fear turns into faith and challenges become the perfect setting for divine intervention. In this study, we'll uncover the hidden lessons in Elijah's life, lessons that can transform the impossible into miracles in your own walk. After all, Elijah's story isn't just about him. It's about how God works in the lives of those who trust him, even in the storms. Elijah, known as the prophet who confronted kings and performed extraordinary miracles, experienced a moment of profound emotional vulnerability. After one of the greatest feats of his life, the confrontation on Mount Carmel, he faced threats from Jezebel, the ruthless queen who vowed to kill him. Imagine the intensity of this moment. Someone who had witnessed God's fire consuming the sacrifice now found himself hiding in a cave, overwhelmed by fear and exhaustion. Does this sound familiar? Sometimes, even after significant victories, we are overtaken by a wave of insecurity that feels crushing. Elijah shows us that even the strongest face crises, and this doesn't make us any less worthy, it makes us deeply human. Elijah's exhaustion was not just physical, but also spiritual. He felt overwhelmed, believing he was alone in the fight for faithfulness to God. How often do we carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, thinking no one understands what we're going through? To deal with this, the first step is recognizing the need to pause. God did not rebuke Elijah for his discouragement, but provided rest and nourishment. Here's the practical lesson. Respect the limits of your body and mind. How about taking a moment at the end of the day to care for yourself? A warm bath, sincere prayer, or even disconnecting from social media can be transformative actions. Beyond rest, God spoke to Elijah gently and intimately through a whisper. This is so significant. Often we expect answers in grand events, but God works in the details. For instance, have you noticed how a conversation with a close friend or even a sunset can renew your strength? Elijah teaches us that in the midst of chaos, we need to quiet our hearts to hear God's voice. It's in that silence that we find the faith to carry on. Try this today. Take a few minutes to disconnect from everything and focus on hearing what God has to say. Elijah's journey against discouragement was not just about what he faced, but about how God sustained him. Every miracle in his life, every moment of divine care reminds us that we are not alone, even in the darkest valleys. Just as Elijah was led from fear to faith, we can all experience God's care in our own stories. After all, this is just part of the narrative. Are you ready to discover how the fire on Mount Carmel changed everything? Picture this scene: 450 prophets of Baal against one man, Elijah, in a public challenge to prove who the true God was. The crowd gathered, eager to see which power would manifest that day. Elijah, with courage that could only come from unshakable faith, proposed that each side call on their God, and the one who responded with fire would be proven true. What a dramatic moment. This wasn't just a physical confrontation, but a spiritual battle. Elijah knew his confidence was not in himself, but in the God who never fails. This alone teaches us something powerful. Faith rooted in God's care transforms fear into opportunities for miracles. The prophets of Baal cried out, shouted, danced, and even hurt themselves, trying to gain their God's attention. But silence was their only response. Elijah, on the other hand, approached the altar calmly. He knew he didn't need spectacles to attract divine favor. Then, after a simple prayer, God sent fire from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water surrounding it. This extraordinary event was a turning point in Israel's history. Just as Elijah trusted in God's power, you can also face seemingly impossible challenges, knowing you are not alone. Think about it. What altars in your life need to be rebuilt to see God's fire at work? But here's a detail often overlooked. Before the fire fell, Elijah instructed that the altar be soaked with water, something that seemed absurd during a drought. This teaches us that faith often defies logic. Applying this to your reality, consider areas where you need to take steps of faith even when circumstances seem contrary. Perhaps it's choosing to forgive someone who hurt you or investing in a dream that feels distant. Just as God responded to Elijah's bold gesture, he can also respond to yours. Mount Carmel wasn't just about Elijah's victory, but about God's character being revealed. It showed that it's not about our strength or abilities, but about his power working in our weakness. And it's precisely in the most challenging moments that God's care shines brightest. Elijah reminds us that even before a hostile crowd, faith can turn fear into triumph. But Elijah's story doesn't end here. Have you ever wondered how God cared for him after this event? After the intense confrontation on Mount Carmel, Elijah entered a state of deep exhaustion. He fled into the wilderness, isolated, feeling utterly abandoned, and asking God to take his life. It's striking how a man who had witnessed fire from heaven was now so fragile. This reminds us that even the strongest have limits, and that God's care is not just for moments of glory, but especially for the days when the weight of the world feels unbearable. In his infinite compassion, God didn't rebuke Elijah for his weaknesses, but provided rest and sustenance. A valuable lesson. Sometimes, all we need is to pause, breathe, and let God take care of us. In the wilderness, an angel of the Lord brought Elijah bread and water, urging him to eat and regain strength. Think about it. God could have used any means, but he chose something as simple and basic to sustain the prophet. This teaches us that divine care doesn't always come spectacularly. Often, it's found in everyday details we overlook. For instance, have you noticed how moments of silence or a good night's sleep can renew your perspective? Perhaps it's time to pay more attention to the small provisions God places in your life. A coffee with a friend, a sincere hug, or even a moment of prayer are signs of divine care that shouldn't be ignored. Beyond physical sustenance, God offered Elijah something even more valuable: his presence. When Elijah took refuge in a cave, God didn't manifest through an earthquake, a powerful wind or fire, but through a gentle whisper. This demonstrated that divine care isn't just visible, but also intimate and personal. Perhaps you're waiting for grand answers, but God may be speaking to you in simple, profound ways. Why not start noticing the subtle signs of his presence? Reading scripture or meditating on a psalm can be a practical way to create space to hear God's voice. That time in the wilderness didn't mark the end of Elijah's mission, but a necessary pause to prepare him for what lay ahead. God's care equipped him to face new challenges with renewed courage. Similarly, the moments when we feel God's care can be the beginning of something greater in our lives. And speaking of miracles and provision, have you heard about the ravens of Cherith? The next part of Elijah's story is even more fascinating. The ravens at Cherith. Before the confrontation on Mount Carmel and his flight into the wilderness, Elijah had already experienced God's supernatural care in a most unusual way. God instructed him to hide by the brook Cherith, far from the watchful eyes of King Ahab and Jezebel. It was there, in that secluded place, that Elijah witnessed one of the most curious miracles in the Bible. Ravens bringing bread and meat to him daily. Imagine the scene. Birds, which normally consume meat themselves, delivering it to a hungry prophet. This act not only demonstrated God's provision, but also showed that he can use the most unlikely means to care for us. What makes this story so fascinating is how God chose to sustain Elijah. He could have sent angels or created a banquet, but instead he used ravens, animals considered unclean in Israelite culture. This teaches us that God's care isn't limited by our expectations. He acts in ways that surprise us, often using situations or people we'd never imagine. Think about it. How many times has help come from the least expected source? Perhaps it was a coworker you barely knew, or even a stranger in a critical moment. These instances remind us that God works through the unexpected. Beyond the physical provision, the experience at Cherith taught Elijah a lesson in trust. He had to rely on the daily arrival of food without knowing where it came from or when it would arrive. This dependence is a challenge for many of us. We live in a culture that values planning and security, but God calls us to trust Him even when the future seems uncertain. A practical way to apply this is by cultivating gratitude, even for small blessings. How about starting a journal where you note something you're thankful for every day? This practice helps us recognize how God constantly cares for us. Cherith wasn't just a place of provision, but also of preparation. During that time of isolation, Elijah was strengthened physically and spiritually for the challenges ahead. Likewise, the moments when we feel hidden can be periods when God is working in us, preparing us for something greater. After Cherith, Elijah was led to even more extraordinary experiences, including his spectacular departure. But before that, the narrative reveals yet another striking demonstration of God's care. Elijah's departure. Elijah's departure is one of the most extraordinary events in biblical history. Picture the scene. The prophet and his disciple, Elisha, walking together, fully aware that this would be Elijah's last day on earth. This moment wasn't marked by sadness, but by a unique solemnity. Elijah would not face death as others do, but would be taken to heaven in a whirlwind, a clear demonstration of his special connection with God. This event makes us reflect on what it means to live a life so aligned with God's purposes that even one's departure becomes miraculous. Before being taken, Elijah tested Elisha's determination, repeatedly asking him to stay behind. Yet, Elisha refused, insisting on remaining by his mentor's side. This act of loyalty teaches us about the importance of perseverance and learning from those who walk closely with God. When the moment finally came, Elijah asked Elisha what he desired as a legacy. Elisha requested a double portion of Elijah's spirit, showing his desire not only to follow in the prophet's footsteps, but to go even further in his mission. This story inspires us to seek more, not just blessings, but the responsibility that comes with them. The climax occurred when Elijah was taken to heaven in a chariot of fire, drawn by fiery horses. What a spectacular sight! Elisha watched until the prophet disappeared from view, leaving behind his mantle, a symbol of the ministry that now passed to the disciple. This moment illustrates a powerful principle. Each generation is called to carry the legacy of the previous one. but with its own anointing and mission. Reflect on this. What legacy are you building to leave for others? More importantly, are you prepared to take on what God has for you? Elijah's departure didn't mark the end of his influence, but the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's history. Elisha took up the mantle, performing miracles that proved the same God who sustained Elijah continued to work. This transition reminds us that even when great leaders depart, God's care remains. He continues to guide, sustain, and fulfill his purposes. And so, Elijah's story becomes an invitation to reflect on how we can trust in God's plan, even during life's most challenging transitions. Elijah left us a legacy of faith, courage, and reliance on God that transcends time. His life proves that even in moments of discouragement, threats, and seemingly impossible circumstances, God is present, sustaining and guiding those who trust in him. Now take a moment to reflect. Are you ready to let go of your fears and entrust your life to God as Elijah did? Perhaps your story is ready for a new beginning, a miracle that can only happen when you fully trust in God's care. Consider how you can apply these lessons in your own life. Why not start with something simple, like setting aside daily time to listen to God's voice, as Elijah did? Or maybe it's time to rebuild forgotten spiritual altars by dedicating more time to prayer and studying the Bible. Each small step could be the beginning of a larger transformation. Are you ready to step into the role God has prepared for you in this generation? Now here's a challenge. Have you discovered the purpose God has for your life? Elijah shows us that even when we feel at the end of our strength, God has already prepared something extraordinary. It's time to act. Put your faith into practice, trust in God's care, and prepare to experience moments that will impact not only your life, but also those around you. If this content has touched your heart and provided valuable insights, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here we continue to explore biblical stories and reveal truths that transform lives. Share this message with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, you are not alone on this journey. God is caring for you, even in the driest deserts.